Welcome to the second session of this forum. As Kamal said, in this session we're going to focus on the question of G20 and global governance and the governance issues associated with the management of the G20 process. As the first panel discussed, in many ways the G20 can be seen as one of the most successful international organisations has ever been in terms of the achievement of dealing with the global financial crisis in 2008. And the transformation, as Kamal mentioned this morning, of international governance through the formation of the G20, the elevation of the finance ministers and central bankers' meetings to a summit-level process to deal with the financial crisis, this time in 2008, was a remarkable transition in global governance, changing fundamentally the structure of global governance through the incorporation of a new array of players into the central table of its management. And when you think about it, the way in which that happened was quite spectacularly successful. Here you had a group of major powers meeting for many years in a much smaller process, representing the industrial economies, the industrial powers, suddenly expanding their dialogue, some of them not so willingly, a bit reluctantly, to a group that included a whole range of countries representing the most important economies in the world economy, but a whole range of economies that hadn't had a seat at the table before, including the major emerging powers, China, India, Indonesia in our region, Korea, of course, and Japan at a different stage from our region, Brazil, and the Latin American economies, and also, of course, Middle East and Turkey and Africa. And this was a wholly new and rapid development, and it stuck together incredibly well around the initial years of managing the crisis and the focus on that. But there are questions of, by what right do these economies manage the process, and more technically, what's the legitimacy of the G20 process in global economic governance? And I guess those questions were fairly subdued, although they weren't absent in the early phases of managing the process. And but they've become a little louder in recent times. Paola, you've written about this question of the legitimacy of the G20 in its role in global governance. What's at the heart of that? What's the problem?
Well, let's go back a bit to the history of the G20, and actually 5 years ago today, when the G20 were upgraded to a leaders forum in a summit, which was called with very short notice in Washington, exactly 5 years ago. And before that, the G20 were a group of, with the finance ministers, a meeting of finance ministers and central bankers from a group of 20 countries. And 20 countries which included the advanced economies as well as some of the key developing countries. And that group was called together at the time of the Asian crisis in 1998. So again, when the world was the world economies was collapsing in following the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, so there was the urgency to really get countries together around the table to discuss how to resolve the crisis. So the G20 was the already made, the existing group, which actually fit the purpose, and for that time it was not the G7, it was not the G8, it was broader. It got in the BRICS, so the key emerging market economies, These countries were already used to work together, in particular the work done through the finance ministers and central bankers, central bank governance. So there was, again, they were used to deal with the crisis because they were created on the back of the financial crisis in Asia. So they were there, and they were, so why not? And so that is the history of the G20 summit meeting. And as the G20 got to deal with the crisis, so nobody really asked why the G20, why these countries, why, which was the criteria to select these countries and not others. And again, there were actually used some ad hoc measures, like inviting some of the countries around the table, not be full members, but basically be observers. Some of them, Spain, for example, were there since the beginning, I think since the Washington summit, and it got a sort of de facto invitation to be a member. Then again, it was changed, this system of inviting countries, and now is a bit more flexible, and the president, the chair of each year, invites a group of countries around the table. Again, it's a way to address the issue of who should be around the table. So again, when the G20 was really facing the crisis, the urgency of the crisis, everybody thought then representing 85% of the world GDP was a good enough criterion. If the G20 has the ambition to become more than just a crisis committee, but become a permanent group a forum to deal with key economic and financial issues, then some of these issues of legitimacy needs to be addressed.
Then how, Changyong, you were, before you were chief economist of the ADB, you were Sherpa to President Rhee in Korea in running the G20 process in 2010. How do you see these questions of legitimacy being resolved?
I think it will be impossible to resolve this legitimacy issue unless G20 become an institution with charter and everything. But that will actually kill the many merits of the G20. So at this moment, we probably have to be practical. G20 is a historical outcome. So we have 20 countries as a member now. I don't know why, what kind of criterion, but now it exists. And how to actually incorporate more non-members' voices so they can increase the legitimacy rather than establish the legitimacy as it is. So the key issue is how to enhance the voice of non-G20 countries. In that sense, we can think about two ways of doing it. One is mechanisms, and the other one is more subject. In terms of mechanisms, as Paola mentions, that now we're inviting non-G20 member countries. Australia, I think I really commend that you are inviting Myanmar, even before you start your presidency. So inviting on a rotation basis to many non-member countries so that we can incorporate their voice is very important. But one important thing is that High-Legendam process of G7 did the same thing, but they give an impression that the invite members are really guests, a second citizen. So it's very important to make the invited guests to give a crucial role so that they feel like they can exactly represent non-G20 members rather than being just a guest for the legitimacy of G20. So to give a more explicit role and inviting from the beginning, make them as a crucial part of all this process is very important. And also it's not just for the members, countries. I think incorporating other stakeholders such as the NGOs, and there's now we have a business G20 and youth G20, all kinds of things. When Korea hosted our meeting, we were encouraged not to expand our, this other process and say that if you expand it, it dilutes G20. So we are really discouraged not to do any other things. But ex post, after I finished this job, I really encourage the Australia to do young G20, business G20, or other meetings, as long as it's not perhaps same time as a G20 meeting. So as a year long, if you give more chance for the NGOs to speak themselves and also the youth people to say them things, so that you have an opportunity to advertise your country as well as to give them a venue to represent their voices. I think unless you really focus on practical issues in real G20, the risk of dilution is not that great. So I think to give them more chance to talk is a good way to enhance the legitimacy. I have a chance to talk about the subject later.
Alok, from an Indian perspective, or from your own Indian perspective, rather than an Indian government perspective, how do you see this question of legitimacy? Does it corrode the authority and the effectiveness of the G20, or other ways of making the process effective with the group as it is, and with the sort of inclusions that both Paola and Changyong have suggested?
Yes, I would go along with what Paola and Changyong have said, and there are the question of legitimacy is both, I think there's an external issue in terms of the face it projects to the outside, and those are the issues which Paolo and Changyong have highlighted. But there's also a question of the internal legitimacy. It's a new organization, and there has to be an element of, for it to work effectively and in a coherent manner, there has to be an element of trust between two disparate groups. You had the G7 and you had the major emerging markets. Till the G20, these groups were generally, largely talking past each other. They had different fora. They rarely signed up to the same document for which they took ownership. And now that has started. I mean, the leaders, the G20 leaders, both from the G7, the developed countries and developing countries, are now sitting on the same table. They're coming out with documents for which they take ownership. They own every word of that. But there are still a lot of constructive ambiguities. Those who have been following G20 documents will see that although you have agreed, there's an agreement on that, but if you read in between the lines, you will see that there are actually major disagreements. So, and as we have gone along, this ties up to the question of the effectiveness of the G20. It was seen as some sort of a crisis, that has been successful in a crisis, and now that the crisis is behind us, it is less effective. See, it is moving to a higher level of cooperation. In the early stage of the crisis, there was an agreement between everybody what needed to be done. Fiscal policy, monetary policy, trade. But as we have moved along, there is a disagreement even among economists as to how exactly do you go on fiscal policy. If you look at fiscal policy, austerity or growth, the question of public debt. So, I mean, there seem to be fairly valid sort of arguments on both sides. If you look at monetary policy, it is again growth versus financial stability. Now, on which side, where the G20 should be tilted. Now, to get an agreement on this, you need a fairly, a coherence coming from the academic community as well, which I see, absent. But then, now the G20 is also moved to a high level from, coming to commitments and coming to assessing each other. Now, for these, if it's within the G7, they probably have some sort of a, process or a level of trust to move to this level. But when these two groups come together, you have problems, you become what you call defensive, and it's difficult to get effective decision making. And in a sense, economic integration has moved far ahead of political integration. Now, these are questions which even, the Euro Union, Eurozone and the European Union is encountering. They are finding it difficult to, have come to sort of decisions which are acceptable across the whole grouping, because between Southern Europe and Northern Europe, there's still elements of trust and sovereignty. And I think the G20 stands not far behind in terms of the sort of issues it would need to confront to function as a legitimate organization within itself as well.
I want to come back to the question of the crisis management dimension of the G20's function a little later on, but just on this question, Yiping, Huang from Peking University, how do you see the G20 travelling in terms of the deepening of dialogue across the obvious initial interests in the G20 between industrial countries and what we might loosely call the BRICS or the emerging economies?
Well, I think the common Chinese assessment is that G20 offers a very unique opportunity for industrial and developing countries to talk to each other. And this is obviously the first time that we sit around the table alongside the G7, which used to be the decision maker for global economic affairs. But if you look at the real progress after the crisis, I think it's a very progress has been very limited, and certainly you can see from the Chinese point of view, there is a significant mismatch between its economic influence and its effectiveness in international organizations like G20. I think partly because this is a new institution, but I think China also takes a lot of responsibilities on its own because it's just not experienced and doesn't really know how to act in an international setting. So it's on a learning curve, and I hope there will be a very steep learning curve.
Paola, you were associated in particular with the background development of the London Summit, and that would be identified as one of the more successful G20 summits, I suppose. What were the main elements in success as you see it there?
Well, we can identify some ingredients of this successful recipe. The first one actually, leaders need to be involved, they need to be very engaged. And in the UK at the time, the Prime Minister Gordon Brown was absolutely behind the G20, to the point then there was even an implicit recognition as the G20 as the new force of global economic governance, as opposed to the G8. And at a certain point, there was even a friction between the chair of the G20 in 2009 and the chair of the G8. And it became a sort of, then everything was resolved in a very nice way. But that was the point. The G20 was the future, the G8 was perceived to be the past. So Gordon Brown was very engaged, and obviously he drove with him all the team at the both Cabinet Office and the Treasury. The other thing was because there was this very the other important thing is the UK was at the center of the crisis, because the crisis originated in the US and moved to the UK. So basically, there was a big question mark around the sustainability of a model of financial regulator, of soft, light touch of financial regulation, and generally even the growth model, which has supported growth in countries like the United States and the UK, but also in Europe and countries like Spain, which were all at the center of this financial crisis. So the UK had a very strong stake in this process, and there was, and the G20 were called explicitly to solve the crisis and to stop the crisis and to really prevent future crises. So that obviously galvanized the public opinion. There was a lot of interest. London is one of the leading international financial centers, so being in London really was a very, very important. And again, there was the whole business community and the financial community which was involved. The other thing is that the British presidency made a deliberate choice of involving and engaging with the civil society. So there were lots and lots of events, round tables, discussions, and many people inputted in the British agenda. In fact, at a certain point, this agenda had become incredibly big and unmanageable, and then there was a subsequent attempt to reduce it. So this is all very important. But again, the final point is, at that time, the whole world economy was collapsing together. So there was a shared sense that things needed to be improved, and the countries had to work together. And as it was said in the previous panel, there was the spectrum, the experience of the 1930s, which somehow haunted the whole experience of the G20. So there was a very clear understanding and awareness that countries didn't want to go back to that experience. They wanted to avoid that experience. So promoting and supporting a multilateral dialogue and an informal dialogue like the G20 was perceived to be the way forward.
Changyong, the Seoul summit took place in very different circumstances from the one that Paola described in London. There was a sense in Seoul that we were coming out of the crisis, that we weren't in fact. Greece was still to happen and so on, but we were coming out of the crisis. And we had to look at restructuring the agenda in the G20 to take account of the long-term sustainable growth dimensions of the interest in global governance. How successful do you think you were at that?
I think before we mention specifically on the Seoul Summit, I think let me talk briefly about our expectation. I think in some sense, as Paola mentioned, London Summit was so successful because we saw in the midst of the crisis, it set the bar too high. So I think in some sense, from that time on, when we say that all the G20 after that becomes less effective, I have to challenge that view. Actually, I think probably we shouldn't expect that much from G20. Even in the first panel, we talk about policy coordination. But do you expect that the G20 say that, oh, now your budget surplus is 2%, and we are in some countries in recession, so you have to help them, so you have to reduce your budget deficit to -1% from 2%. Is that kind of micro policy coordination is what you expect? That's, I think, is almost impossible because, policy is more domestic, and also economic theory has lots of uncertainties. So in that sense, when we have in the midst of crisis, what we agree in London is exceptional things, is very good done. But if you see what has happened to Seoul and in France and Mexico, Russia, you can see huge improvement. For example, now I think when we talk about the mutual assessment process and policy coordination, what in reality we can expect is that leaders can agree on by peer pressure rather than by binding agreement. If they are imposed to do the binding agreement, I think no agreement will be made because of the policy more domestic. But on the other hand, through the peer pressure, they agree to have some mechanism, some excess imbalance can hurt others. So what I'm saying is that we cannot have a paternalistic approach. One country can say, this is good for you, it's good for me, you have to do it. That won't work. But on the other hand, through the peer pressure, if one country's action is too negative to others, too much negative externalities, then they can say that we can address this problem. I think that's the essence of the mutual assessment process, and the G20 agree on to the identifying some excess imbalances, and they through the indicative guidelines, and then they decide to adjust it. As a result, now Chinese current account imbalance, which was 1 point at 10%, now it goes to 3% or less. And then now even we are criticizing U.S. QE, but now we are saying that when you do the monetary policy, you have to think about the consequences to others. Yes, probably will be very difficult to. It will be disappointing to the journalists that why don't you just say to the U.S. that you have to abide by some rules? That will be almost impossible. So I think we have to really reduce. If we accept and we decide to reduce our expectation, I think G20 has achieved a lot. And the current mechanism to talk each other through the peer pressure and having some kind of indicative guidelines to identify excessivity of some policies, I think that's a great thing. And I may be more realistic, I'm not idealistic. So in some sense, in the first panel, we criticized that the G20 cannot come up with a very detailed cooperation mechanism. Yes, in sense, it's true. But on the other hand, I think we have to agree that in reality, I want to emphasize two great achievements. One is that before the G20, all this discussion through the peer pressure was only done by G7 countries. But now G20, now at least the G20, other non-G7 countries can discuss this, this non-peer pressure mechanism. So that's one great achievement. Second, we have indicative guidelines and mutual assessment process. That is a great mechanism. So if the crisis come again, we can do the same thing as in London. So I think I would rather see the bright side of the G20.
Sorry, can I say something? I don't think it's actually a question of reducing the expectation. I think there's a very important that the G20 maintains their ambition, and they have to be. I think the question is communication. And it is important. In London was easier to communicate and easier to drive the public opinion behind this project. And I think about in the following G20, I think there was a substantial lack of good communication, right? To say, telling people are not stupid, telling them what the G20 is for, why is there, why do the leader meet once a year, why all these people are behind the scene doing a fantastic job and making a lot of progress, and explain them rather than just managing expectations. And obviously, and explaining how one G20 is different from the other because the circumstances are different. But I think communication is critical.
But I'm sorry, when I say it's an expectation, I mean that, remember when we, in Korea, when we have discussing global imbalances, when we introduce mutual assessment process and indicative guidelines, the media's reaction, the criticism is that, oh, this guy has non-binding agreement. So that's what I'm saying. Whether this G20 is evaluated, whether they agree on the binding agreement or not, if that is expectation, we cannot meet them. That's my point.
Absolutely.
That's
but again, it's communicating the media, tell the media what to expect.
Well, there are two dimensions of the influence of the G20 that's important, that you've been emphasizing the importance of bringing to the meeting independent agendas by the members and participants in the process, there being no supranational legal framework to bind them to anything. So the G20 itself relies on that, what members bring to the process, and that's one dimension of it. But another dimension of it, of course, is how the process plays in to the shaping and management of global institutions that do have legal stature and international sway, the IMF, the bank, and potentially also the WTO. So I wonder, Yiping, if you look at it from a Chinese perspective, you mark China low on what it brought to the process thus far. What are China's ambitions from the viewpoint of what role China might play in shaping the game beyond the process, as it were, through the institutions and the rules and norms that countries of influence like G20 countries have the potential to shape?
Well, I think China, my own interpretation is that China sees G20 more like a dialogue forum for the elite group in the global economy. It doesn't see G20 as a rule-making body for the world, and this is why I think we probably can forget about the legitimacy issue for a while. I'm not saying this is not important, but at the end of the day, Deng Xiaoping once said, white or black mice, a mice is a good mice if it catches a rat, a cat. I'm sorry, I'm confused. A cat is a good cat if it catches a mice. So depend on what is your purpose. And I think the G20 platform provides a very good platform for effective communication. On the other hand, you do have lots of very legitimate institutions already, and they don't work. So that's something I think we need to keep in mind when we look at. The expectation for China, obviously, this is more like how China should improve on these. China's particular interest, obviously, is to raise the voice of the developing countries in the forum and making input into the dialogue process. But it has to be a lot more flexible going forward in terms of identifying its interest. I think somebody said earlier in the panel, the Chinese interest is actually quite mixed. It doesn't have one single line of interest identifying with either Asian country or with developing country or with Asian country, because it actually is very mixed. Sometimes it's in line with the developing countries, sometimes it's in line with the developed countries. So it needs to be very flexible. And I think G20 has a very mixed group, provides a good forum.
Let me press you a bit on what China can bring to the next G20 process. Coming up through 2014, we've just had the third plenum and commitment to a new round of reforms that we're still trying to get our heads around in the rest of the world. But given where China's heading, what could China bring into the G20 discussions in the next year or so?
I'm not so sure about the institutions themselves, but I think the third plenum is about economic reform, really push China into a much more mature market economy. Everything else in China, everybody in China is talking about the year 2020. Looks like it will be very critical. 2020, Shanghai will be the international financial center. 2020, our income will be doubled. 2020, the third plenum said will make a critical progress in terms of establishing socialist system with Chinese characteristics. 2020 will reach basic capital account convertibility. And in my own view, is 2020 China will be the largest economy in the world. China will become a high-income country. With all these, I think what China really needs to do is to improve its institutional capability in providing some kind of leadership in the G20. But I think overall China is not yet ready to play a leadership role. But there are issues that China may want to play at the future G20 meetings. Infrastructure is a big thing, even in the minds of the Chinese policymakers, because we think we do well in infrastructure building, and we have lots of foreign exchange reserves to help other countries if you're interested. There are lots of discussions about the increasing funding and restructuring the international organizations. That's something I think G20 may be able to tackle, because at the moment, institutions like World Bank and IMF still dominated by the developed countries, and that's something we probably can change.
Well, one of the ways, and we discussed this infrastructure thing quite a bit in the first session, but one of the ways in which China could bring value to the table would be to socialize this infrastructure bank idea. But one question about that, I think was touched upon a bit in the first channel, is in fact how that institution might relate to the other institutions that we have for doing the same sort of business in the region, Changyong's institution, globally, the World Bank and so on. Do you see there being close links between this idea in China and established institutions for serving similar purposes?
I think obviously there will be very close links and collaborations between different sorts of development banks. But the reality is the reason why you're establishing new institutions is because people are not happy with the existing institutions. That's the end of the story. So yes, there will be coordination, and I think in terms of broad guideline principle helping the global economy to develop, that's the same. But I think the priority is the decision-making process and who make the call will be different. Otherwise, you don't need, you just increase the funding for the World Bank or for ADB, but obviously people are not happy with these institutions.
Alok, looking again from another big emerging country's perspective in India, how do you see the question of India's playing into the various constituencies that are represented across the G20 process?
Could you sort of amplify?
Well, in particular, in respect of the issues that, the reform issues and the way in which India carries forward its national reform agenda and brings that to the table.
Well, India is, among, it's a large economy, but among the G20 countries in terms of per capita income, it is still, by the long way, what you call the poorest. So, questions of, growth, inequality, inclusive growth. So these are sort of issues which are sort of very relevant and close to what you call India's agenda on the one hand, and then the infrastructure issue. And our Prime Minister has in several summits been consistently raising the issue of infrastructure, which we discussed at great length in the morning. And so, we would like to, highlight, these concerns and get, constituencies on board here. And many of the, the countries for which these issues are a concern may not be directly represented within the G20. So it is sort of, from India's perspective, is to sort of the outreach and to get these issues on the table.
When you say outreach, you mean outreach to non-member countries?
Yes.
Yeah. And in the region in particular, do you see that being carried, India playing a role in carrying that through the region?
Yes, India has mechanisms within the region because India is the largest economy in the South Asian region, and there's a lot of scope for economic integration. And South Asia is one of the poorest regions in the world, and we need to sort of push ahead with regional. It's one of the most economically unintegrated region in the world, and so that is one agenda which we are pushing in the region.
The other dimension of outreach, which Paola, you and Changyong, you mentioned, was outreach to the communities in the G20 itself. And London led the way in many respects in that field, but also I think Korea, you hosted the B20 for the first time. President Rhee hosted that meeting, and so that process has developed quite a long way since then through to St. Petersburg. How important do you see that for the process going forward?
Well, good communication is essential. It's essential to get people on board. And let me step back a bit to the beginning of this conversation. Why is it important to communicate well, to get people on board within countries, the public opinion, but also why it is important, the issue of legitimacy for the G20? It is because the decision made by the G20s have potentially very important consequences and implications for everybody and for every country. So we live in an more integrated global economy, and we are no longer in a situation that Ben Bernanke described in a very effective way in one of his first appearances as the Fed chairman about 10 years ago. When you refer to the center and the periphery. That was the idea of the world economy which prevailed in the 1960s, 1970s. We are no longer there. We're no longer a case where there is a center which tells the art, which does whatever it thinks is appropriate, and the periphery accepts the action and the implications and the impact of the actions from the center. Now we say we live in a multi-polar world where countries are really part of this process. So it's very important that the G20 takes into account and its decisions. Obviously, there are 85%. The countries around the table represent 85% of the world economy. But that is not enough in an integrated world economy just to say we wash our hands, we do what we need to do, and the rest have to live with the consequences. It's no longer the G7 world. And that's the same for people, and people want to know why the leaders organize these meetings. And the outreach is not only to tell the people how good the leaders are, it's not a propaganda machine, it's just democracy, it's just to tell people, this is what we're thinking, and again, back to the previous panel is, this is how the world should rebalance, the economy should rebalance, this is why we need you to accept or to face these policies because we want to move towards a better world. And these are things that need to be told. Otherwise, there is a disconnect between what people think and what leaders think, and what leaders do and people want them to do. And again, I come from Europe, and I see the big mistake done within the European Union, and in particular within the monetary union, where people were not told why they had to support this, and particularly when governments went back to people and said, actually, we ask you to really, you need to face this big austerity package, but we don't tell you why, and you do it. And that's not, and obviously people feel very alienated, and they move away from a project and which is fundamentally very good.
Changyong, yeah.
As Paola said, communication is key, but I think it's more than that. I think, I hope Australia and the G20 do not make some same mistake in terms of outreach that G7 did. In my opinion, in G7 meetings, the outreach was regarded as a condescending kind of attitude. We are the first-class citizens. We invite you to come, and we take a picture with you, and they make us good, and you good too. That kind of things work. Doesn't work. Actually, outreach, in my experience, when we do the Seoul Summit, helped a lot in developing the agenda. I think I would rather say, when we first think about how we introduce development topic, we are worried about it. Okay, if you open the development issues, then people will say how much money you have. And given that the recession in advanced economies, if you cannot mobilize money, and people will say that it's a failure of development channel and we look bad, so should we do it or not was a kind of issue. But at the time, our president asked us to do the outreach. Let's hear first what they want to. And so we went to Africa, and then it was former Prime Minister Mallis and many leaders in African Development Bank, which solved our problem. They said that, when you do the development, don't worry about the money. Okay, we expect that they already G7 countries pledge lots of money which hasn't been disbursed. So having another pledge wouldn't help. But on the other hand, they want to us that why don't you focus on the infrastructure? In the last 30 years, infrastructure become a bad word partly because of the bad governance issues. So many, the World Bank and many, the aid agencies and NGOs think that the infrastructure and government-led development agenda is a bad thing. We have to do more social work kind of things. But on the other hand, many African leaders say that we have changed it. Now we need what is a bottleneck of the growth was the infrastructure. So if Korea G20 hosts, G20 and the Korea can emphasize the importance of the infrastructure as a major bottleneck, that will empower these African countries and Asian countries to say to the World Bank, to say ADB that infrastructure important, G20 leaders endorse these things, so why don't you shift your portfolio into a more infrastructure investment? That actually, they told us that that is a key. So in some sense, every issue was criticized as trickle-down theory, but they believe that sometimes trickle-down theory can work. So they emphasize the infrastructure investment. So that, I think, is what we learned from the outreach, and that helps a lot. So I hope that there are two lessons. One is that we, G20, shouldn't have condescending attitude. through the outreach activity from the NGOs, from the non-G20 members, we can really develop the new agenda, I mean this for the G20. And that kind of more constructive attitude toward the outreach will be very helpful. Second, I'm very happy to see that the infrastructure become a major issue. And we started it from Korean development channel, and we really want to emphasize infrastructure, but somehow it's diluted, and now it's very happy to see that it's back to the main agenda. But my one comment is that by listening to the first channel and what Australian governments are thinking, I think you're right. In some sense, infrastructure investment is not just for the developing countries. It's also important for the growth for the developed world. So it's over the whole all across the whole. It's important theme for all issues. But on the other hand, I may be biased because I really was one of the key person to launch a development channel. If you focus on the infrastructure, but I hope that even though you emphasize infrastructure, please do not forget the development angle. So if you just thinking about this is a job creation or other things, and the financing mechanism for funding mechanism, all these things, not talking about the developing countries and the low-income countries, then I think this can be an issue for whole world, but maybe you lose the development angle, which is very important.
The infrastructure issue plays clearly into the development angle. It also plays in, as we saw in the first
I know that
session,
Sheel do it, but my point is that don't forget it.
May I, on this, I think, when South Korea injected development into the G20, agenda, and I think it sent a very powerful message insofar as outreach to, the poorer and developing, countries was concerned. But what I would beg to differ with Changyong is the centrality of the financing issue. Now, infrastructure has been on the table of the G20 ever since Seoul. In fact, in most summits since then, it has featured more and more prominently. And in the last summit, it has actually been mainstreamed even into the framework. But I don't think the G20 has squarely confronted the financing of infrastructure issue squarely. It has come out with a lot of reports, replicated much of the work which the MDBs have been doing. Now, of course, the financing issue has to be addressed in several ways. One of the issues which was raised by Trevor in the morning session was that if you are going to get private investment in, what are the sort of enabling environment you are going to put in place. So that is one source of funding. So, which still needs to be, addressed, the policy environment. There is now talk on structural reforms, but it has to be much more focused on how do you get private investment going. The second issue is the multilateral development banks. Now, the G20 has, been overly focused on resourcing the IMF. Now, raising the resources of the MDBs, which would, maximize investment into infrastructure. Now, on this, the question of leadership had come up in the morning, and this leadership has to come from the G20, and it has not been forthcoming. This is an issue which India has been raising repeatedly in the G20. When the capital, of the G20 of the World Bank was announced, I think we were one of the only countries to say that we were actually disappointed with the scale of the outcome. And it's much more, in the case of the World Bank, the impact of raising the ratio between the resources raised and the investment that would accrue is, on a scale of 1:10, whereas in the IMF, it's in the range of 1:1. So you don't need to raise the capital by so much to, leverage huge amounts of infrastructure investment. So that is the second issue. And the third issue, the debate on private investment and, private investment and public investment as far as infrastructure is concerned. And the debate within the G20, I think, has been veering largely in the direction of private investment, which is welcome. But does that mean if private investment is shy, is not forthcoming, animal spirits are absent, then the G20 countries just wait? Or is there a greater role for public investment in infrastructure? So there are certain ideological issues involved as well.
Absent the structural reform element, It's not only private investment that's not forthcoming, internationally sourced public investment is not likely to be forthcoming either. So I think that's half the story that we heard in the first session this morning, a very important part of it. I want to throw this open, especially on the question of public outreach, because I know there are people in the audience that are particularly interested in that issue. But before I do, Yiping, I just want to ask you and Alok, how is the G20 conceived in the community, the broader community, the policy-interested community, if you like, in China and India? Is it seen as an important and positive element in global governance, or is there a more negative attitude towards it? Alok?
Well, in India, there is a perception that you have a crisis out there, but much of the levers of growth and development are domestic, and you need to get your domestic economy. Compared to many other emerging markets, the engines of growth are domestic. The demand is domestic. You run a huge current account deficit. In a demand-constrained world, our major problem today is on the supply side. If we can get a supply going, demand is not the issue. So from this perspective, the view is that, the G20, yes, there's a feeling that you are at the high table, but I think in terms of civil society engagement, it has not been as sort of deep so far as at least I would have liked, because there are issues of interdependence, integration, and we are becoming a much more interdependent world.
Yiping?
Well, I think I actually mentioned at the very beginning, it's perceived as a very important internet development. But if you look at its performance, I think of the Chinese perspective is the part that we become very excited. Participation of developing countries in decision making has been less than satisfactory. And especially if you look at the issues, I am interested personally on the monetary policy, international monetary system, financial regulation, and so on. Number one, there has been little progress. And number two, the agendas is not significantly different from the G7 agenda if you compare the two. So I certainly that I think is a major disappointment for many people in China, certainly the policymaking circle. Just to give you one example, at the central bank meeting in Moscow, Zhou Xiaochuan, the governor, criticized the QE policy, and some other policymakers from other developing countries did the same. There was no reflection in the final statement at all. But as you could even see in discussion here, people think that's something we just have to accept, and I think that's something we can't accept just like this.
Well, I think the conversation here this morning suggests a repositioning on precisely that issue that's really important to the success of the G20 meeting in Australia.
Right, but the other point I mentioned earlier on, the reason why it's been less than satisfactory, we should also blame ourselves, not just others.
Yeah. Well, let's throw it open to questions from the floor on any aspect of the governance question that's been issues that have been raised in the conversation. Can we have a mic up here?
Thank you. My name is Cassandra Goldie, and I'm the CEO of the Australian Council of Social Service, which is the peak body for social services in Australia. So the NGO, a lot of the NGO community here in Australia, and I'm also the Deputy Chair of the C20 Steering Committee in Australia. So I am particularly interested, of course, in the issues of the legitimacy and the public outreach, but increasingly also, of course, the capacity for civil society to impact in a significant way on the outcomes of the G20. And I'm interested in your views about how the C20 process, which is still very new, can contribute to the architecture of the G20 process to build its capacity for not only the outside of the tent engagement of civil society, but the involvement in the deliberations in the lead up to the major meeting, and of course the outcome of the process overall. Thank you.
Paola, would you like to start with that, because you were at the ground floor of development of those processes in a way?
Well, I think the most important thing, in my view, is to have a very clear goal. Why you want to and what you want to do. I mean, what the civil society want to do, and how they want to interact with the G20. And so, and you said the two important points. One is to contribute to the agenda, which is critical, and the other one to be more involved in the process, which I think it is more difficult. And I think obviously there is a huge competition in countries with a vibrant civil society for the attention of the G20. And so it is very important to be to really be up to the point. What is the point you want to come across, and why it's important? Because the bombardment of input is enormous. And there is a limit to how much it can be taken on board. So, and again, I think because the G20, and we had a really interesting discussion yesterday, is more and more, like we said, a strategic forum, is for the big picture. Then, of course, you drill down some of this big division into, stream of work. But then again, it really has this sort of broad approach. I think, it would be very important to avoid to go down to the really micro level, and perhaps think of better interlocutor for some of the more specific issues, and just keep the principles the view on the principle.
Anyone else want to?
I mean,
Changyong? Yeah.
from my experience, I think there are few problems when we talk with the civil society. One problem is that civil society has a diverse, interest. So even they themselves cannot agree on one topic or two topics, which is necessary. So when we talk with them, and then when we go choose one or two, we isolate the others whose topic is not, accepted, and their news release was quite bad for us. So in that sense, that's kind of civil society themselves has to try to reach one or two consensus for G20 rather than just advertising their own, view. That's one thing. The other one is that I think civil society and also many other outside groups really focus only on the, summit itself. So they all want to have the outcome delivered in November, for example, in the next year. Then problem is that even G20 members, while we are preparing, we don't know what will happen in November. So they keep on saying what you are doing on November, then let us know, then we'll help you and we'll give our inputs to you in November. But to speak frankly, the G20 agenda up to November is already changing. And even though the member countries prepare the agenda, something happens, then it becomes, new topics coming in November. So we never know what will happen. So maybe C20, if it happens here during the year, maybe targeting the next year and invite the next year chair, and then give some kind of opinion to them so that G20 can, member countries can prepare and reflect their view maybe more realistic rather than just asking the hosting country to reflect those views.
May I just add to that? I think, there's an interesting paradox at work here. And I would agree that, civil society organizations are still outside the tent, and the G20 remains a governmental organization. But if you look at from a country perspective, the national perspective, with the proliferation of information technology and Facebook and Twitter and the media, the television media, increasingly the national agenda is being, from the viewpoint of experience in India, is being set a lot by the debate going on in civil society. But at the international level, I think there has been no mechanism for this to sort of translate into a, a multilateral forum. Now, when the G20 has a chair, and the chair has to set the agenda, and when it sets the agenda, its national civil society would have an impact on the sort of issues it takes up. But how do you integrate, the Y20 and the B20, which are outside the tent from the multilateral sort of component of civil society, I think is an issue.
Yoshio, over here.
Thank you very much. I was listening to your discussions very with great interest, because the question was the legitimacy of G20. But is this the right question? That is my question. All the members of the G7 leaders were elected or chosen from their individual political processes, so they all have legitimacy. They all have legitimacy for all the questions that come to political leaders. Now, we like the narrative that the G20 was born by the global financial crisis. But if we think about this global financial crisis, was it really a global financial crisis? It was probably not. It was a transatlantic financial crisis which affected United States, UK, Iceland, maybe Belgium, and Spain perhaps for other reasons, and Greece and Italy for other reasons, sovereign debt and so forth. So this crisis exposed global vulnerabilities, but it may not necessarily be the global financial crisis as such. And I think that the birth of G20 is related to the globalization, the need to realize the impact, the extent of globalization. All nations are connected through trade, investment, finance, environment, and also communication, internet, and all other sorts of connectedness. But and I said that political leaders, G20 leaders, are all have all the legitimacy in their political system, but at the same time, they are not. They do not have the freedom to control everything. They have their legislature, they have their press, they have their civil society, they have their citizens. I think the whole point should really be to use this opportunity of political leaders who have these powers, these communication abilities to make sure that the citizenship at large realize the interconnectedness and how to handle this globalization. And I think it is the kind of contribution that this meeting can make.
I think that's more of a comment than a question, but you might like to respond to the comment. To Alok? No. Can we take another question or comment? Yes. Oh, we'll take Huang here, just here, and one up the back later.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Huang from Myanmar. I'm assigned for the Myanmar G20 Sherpa, and I'm really honored for this assignment. And I'm very happy to hear that inequality and poverty, addressing inequality and poverty will be one of the agenda in G20. Because when I listen to the presentations, 80% of world GDP is possessed by the G20, so that the rest, 166 countries, it is obvious that inequality is there and poverty is there. So that this is also in our ASEAN region, also one of our objective is narrowing down the development gaps among the members. That is one of our objective, so that the themes are very similar to ASEAN and G20. And the other thing is Myanmar should represent not only ASEAN, but also LDC, because we are in the list of LDC. Actually, LDC country, we are receiving aids and grants. But actually, we don't want aids and grants always, we want trade. So that we need 3 axes. That is finance access, technology access, and the rest thing is infrastructure or market access. So that infrastructure will be also one of the thing in the one of the agenda in the list. So that we are happy to receive all. To listen all these agendas, and the rest thing is the other thing is achieving MDG goals. That is very important for us, especially for LDCs and developing countries. Mostly developing countries and LDCs focus on quick wins, very short term, so that we should also focus on the long-term and sustainable development, so that we expect to have green growth and green business introduced by the G20 to support, especially in the developing countries, to put it in the agenda. We request Australian presidency to stand for the developing countries and LDCs in favor of addressing poverty and inequality. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paola. Alok, yeah.
See, I think one of the interesting points about the G20 is that it is, since it's roughly 80% of everything. I mean, we talk of growth. If we talk of the world's poor, the world's population, you know, I think the G20 also has about 70 to 80% of the world's poor. I mean, you have China there, you have India there, you have Brazil, you have Mexico. So it's also, so this is one thing about the transition from, you know, a G7 to a G20. So issues of poverty and infrastructure, I mean, the sort of developmental infrastructure as opposed to the replacement infrastructure, have become internal issues of the G20 and not merely an outreach issue. That comes to the second question of the agenda setting within the G20. Right now, I think it's an incipient organization, and much of the agenda setting has not been, centered on these themes. These have been marginal to it. But then this is, I think, the capacity of the younger members of the G20 to be able to, to be able to set the agenda more.
I think that idea of mainstreaming the development agenda within the G20 process that came through from Homi's comments this morning is very important. We'll take a question from up here. Yeah.
Firstly, many thanks to Professor Drysdale and the outstanding panel for the discussion. I'm Nivi, a master's student at ANU, Department of IR. Firstly, if I might just make a very quick comment on legitimacy. From my very simple, maybe perhaps ignorant point of view, I think the G20 certainly has a lot more legitimacy than the permanent members of the Security Council, for instance. India, for instance, was offered a place in the Security Council, but no veto powers. So how can there be a claim for legitimacy when 5 countries sort of decide and can overrule the decisions made by 170 odd countries? That's just my quick comment. The question I had was, I just popped out of another conference regarding Australia 21. It is, climate change is probably the biggest issue of our times. And some have called it the tragedy of the commons. And this is where institutions like the G20 come in for coordination and collaboration. And given now that we see that Kyoto and the rest of the agreements are not really going to take off, right? Unlike Montreal, do you sort of see, people have been discussing geoengineering, beyond mitigation and adaptation, geoengineering, so large-scale human intervention to sort of save the planet. So let me just posit this scenario. It might seem a bit left field and a bit outrageous, but in the case that there is geoengineering, right, do you think, I just posit this question, do you think the G20 has the moral weight and the legitimacy to sort of vote on taking such radical steps to save the planet?
Who'd like to tell Australia how to run the climate change agenda in the G20 process? Alok's going to tell it.
Okay. You raised, I think, two issues. One is about, the Security Council. But, the G20 is the premier forum for economic issues. For geopolitical issues, it still is the G7 and, the Security Council. Those are the steering committees, not the G20. The other issues of, the G20 addressing climate change, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the effectiveness of the G20, but, it is one of, I think, 2 or 3 areas of the spectacular failure of the G20 to address these issues. I mean, this as well as the Doha round. So I think here there is much scope for Australia to address both these issues to be able to turn that around.
Anyone else like to come in on this? Paola?
Well, absolutely, I agree. Then the G20 should also be involved in this kind of discussion. And again, there is a very strong economic and financial dimension in climate change. So, yes, absolutely. The point is how, and to me, the critical question is how to be effective. And in other words, we're not wasting our time. So leaders do not waste their time, and all these good people who actually work behind the scenes are not wasting their time. So how can you be effective? How can you really make a difference, even if in gradual steps? Because one thing which emerged from this panel this morning is that we need to look at the glass as half full rather than half empty, because it's a gradual step of improvement. And so again, I think the sooner the climate change gets on the G20 agenda, the better it is for hoping that something will be eventually done. But then back to my point, then the G20 needs to become more like a permanent committee and just moving away from the crisis and really embrace all sorts of key issues. This is something that is very much in the hands of the Australian presidency, and I personally think that I will watch with a lot of interest what your leaders and government and civil servants will do from December 1st to really sort of shift the narrative of the G20.
Perhaps that's a good note on which to ask you all one last question, really, which is if you're thinking ahead about the Australian presidency of the G20 over the next year or so, what priorities do you think Australia should have in trying to lead the G20 process through 2014? I'll start with you again, Paola.
I wouldn't say priorities because I know there is an agenda and the agenda makes sense to me. I think what is the strategy, and the strategy is engagement, communication, and clarity. So again, key issues on the agenda, try not to have a too crowded agenda, and again, an engagement in particular in this region. I think I see, to me, is Australia is very far away from Europe, but is close to a lot of key countries, in this new world economy. So, yes, go for it.
Changyong?
Subject-wise, I think infrastructure is a good choice, but as a functional-wise, I hope that Australia can contribute significantly to solidify G20 status. So be prepared many form letters in advance. So whenever there is a big earthquake or big flood or big economic events coming in, please announce something before G8 do it.
Alok?
Well, I would focus being from the, the finance, primarily from the finance channel. I would say that, we are today in a position where, the G20 was perhaps in around 2009, 2010, around the time of the Pittsburgh Summit, when there was a view that the global economy is recovering. It did recover to around 5%, and at Summit we had the unfortunate, I think, 5th or 6th paragraph saying that it worked, that what G20 had sort of put, it worked. But I think what we forgot to see is that it recovered to 5.3%, but on life support. It's like, imagine a patient lying on a bed with, a pacemaker here and, wires coming here, and it is alive. Now, we see, and the moment, about 3-4 months ago, an attempt was made to remove one of the pipelines, and just the talk of the taper, one of the minor lines to the patient, and we saw the result, that it started sinking again. So to be able to, maintain this low level of recovery without life support, how does the G20 sort of manage that process? I mean, forget 5% growth, but 3% with normalized macroeconomic policies.
That sets high bars, but important bars. Yiping?
I don't know if there's any specific agenda I like to recommend, but I think Australia sits right in between the G7 countries and a group of developing countries, and then luckily you have good relations with both. So I hope Australia would be able to more balance the voice at the summit and just the broad G20 meeting, and make the institution an even more balanced organization.
Join me in thanking the panel in this session very much.